Macro Social Work Stories, where your voice will be heard, respected, and lifted. Today, we've got Dr. Burghardt, and he's going to be discussing his book, The End of Social Work. And he's got some great points here, which we're going to review a few today. Welcome, Dr. Burghardt.
Well, thanks, Christy. Out there in the world, and I know everybody on here will call me Steve. Yeah, there's a number of things we will cover, but a couple that I just want to get people's attention about. The average social worker is expected to work for free in the Code of Ethics at a number of hours a week, and yet the average social worker already works 45.9 hours a week for a 35-hour paid salary, which means two things. One, that's over 10 hours more, plus that's an average. There's a large number of people above that. And one of the things that we need to address clearly is the idea that social workers must overwork. The way this gets played out as well within academia, just as another example that reinforces the guilt that social workers end up having if they decide they want to work what their job requires them to do, as opposed to this exploitation, is at the last annual public meeting here that we had in Denver. There were 18 different presentations on self-care as the answer to burnout, and only one that addressed working conditions. In academia, we can't assume, nor should anyone in professional leadership, think that the answer to burnout lies only in the individual who's already overworking herself, himself, themselves as well, if we're not taking care of. But if the average social worker, though, not only is told to work extra, the average social worker, the data shows from a conservative group, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average social worker works 45.9 hours a week. They're paid for 35. Now, 45.9 is the average, which means there's a whole bunch of people above 45.9. So if you're doing extra work and your pay's the lowest of any of these professions, why would we have a code of ethics that demands people this expectation that people should work for free? It's unconscionable. It's one of the changes that must happen going forward. Yes, if somebody, look, I think it's great when people
You
on
have to
their own
repeat
decide
that
they're going to do
again.
extra work with a soup kitchen, what they're going to do work on climate change. If one chooses to volunteer,
Hours.
all for it.
39
But,
point, wait,
go
you
ahead.
got to say that again. So social workers work how many hours on average, and they're paid for how many?
Bureau of Labor Statistics, 45.9. Now, don't forget, people are paid for a 35-hour week.
40, right, 49.5. I'm just writing this so I can tweet it.
Right. So
this is important. So 39.
And never forget, an average takes all the people, and says what their numbers are together, which means there's a whole bunch of people above 45.9. So, and again, I want to reiterate, I'm not saying people shouldn't volunteer if you choose to. Because if your church, your synagogue, your mosque, you want to do something down there, if you're an organizer and you see a climate change initiative you want to be a part of course. But the idea that one must do it and pro bono work is encouraged as something reinforces the norm that I call agency social Darwinism. Now, Anna, you're going to read about social Darwinism when you go to social work school. It's the whole idea of the survival of the fittest applied to people. In agencies, it's come to be applied. The better social worker is the one who's more exhausted because they care more than somebody who goes home at 5. And so the norm reinforces this guilt, which we all feel because we're all helper people, this guilt that, oh my God, I'm really not doing enough. So you take this code of ethic that is complete 19th century, and then in the culture, where Dollar General Social Service Agency, where people are not being paid enough to live, and then you make them feel guilty because they don't want to work overtime because they want to go home and take care of their kids, or they just have hypertension. They need to be able to take care of themselves physically. That idea of agency social Darwinism has to go away. It's one of the parts of the culture that we have to take care of, that our leadership must confront as well.
Do you want to also throw in the student loan debt and how that might
Oh,
impact
yeah.
wages here? So we got to take that off the
Student
top.
loan debt. Well, again, think about it. If you're making 47.5 to start, taking conservative statistics, folks, not radical statistics. You know, this is some radical think tank. The average student graduates from a graduate program, like with an MSW, carries somewhere between $38,000 and $68,000 of debt. If it's a BSW, he or she graduates, or they graduate with about between $27,000 and $38,000 of debt. So now the way student loans work, though, is you end up having to pay immediately afterwards, in almost all states immediately, where the amount of money, if you're making 47.5 gross, don't forget that's not net, that's not after taxes, Social Security, all the other things that get taken out. If you have healthcare benefits that are taken out, it means, again, this has been figured out. The average person graduating today, with the level of debt they have from a social work school, can plan to apply for a mortgage in approximately 2052. Now, that's a long time away, people, because the expendable income required for that expendable doesn't exist. When you pay rent, when you pay for part of your medical care, and then you're paying monthly debt, all of that combines to make it impossible for social workers who are entering the field to be able to imagine the idea of that middle-class lifestyle that is assumed to be what professionals want, which is some form of home ownership. Don't forget, home ownership is also a racial equity issue. Home ownership was provided in the 40s to white working class people and denied through redlining and also just denial to people of color. So one of the ways that wealth creation occurs that we in the field want to be able to address is through the forgiveness of student debt and the upping of salaries to allow people the same opportunity that white Americans have had. If we're going to confront issues of racial equity in the field and not just talk it, we've got to look at salary and student debt as something where we advocate and look for ways for the debt to be diminished and taken away, and for salaries to allow people to be able to have access to the type of lifestyle, the type of standard of living, the modest wealth that white working class families have. The average white working class family has wealth of 177,000. The average black family has 6,000. The difference is what? Home ownership. Forget the, Bezos and all that. Sure, of course they up it even more.
You can't qualify for a mortgage.
Correctable.
Yeah.
That we have to take responsibility for. So what happens is I hit you with a lot of this stuff, right? It's like, damn, it's heavy. And at the same time, think about who we are and who the people are that you work with and that you know. Think about Anna, like yourself. We have amazing people coming into the field. We have amazing people in the field. The issue is we need a culture that breaks from this idea that collective activity is wrong. That the answer to burnout, exhaustion, fatigue is only self-care. Now, I'm a believer in self-care. Self-care is a wonderful thing. I try to practice it. I'm doing yoga, not particularly well, but I do yoga. Self-care is good. It will not correct burnout. At the last annual public meeting of the Council of Social Work Education that I was at in 2019, there were 18 sessions on different forms of self-care for social workers. There was one that looked at burnout. Now, academics out there, if you hear this is about what we have to address. Why do we spend so much time on what the individual worker must do to improve their lives at work? And we don't spend time on investigating the working conditions that perhaps require collective response and not just individual self-care response. Now, again, I'm not opposed to self-care, but we have built into this. It's very interesting, Christy. You posted the average salary on Twitter of what nurses make. And I believe, if you could comment on that, you got a response from NASW and CSWE saying, make sure you tell them we haven't endorsed the minimum salary or some such thing. Could you comment on that? Because I thought it was pretty telling.
Right. I went ahead and clarified that it was something I posted, and this isn't a new conversation, right? We've been having this for a long time, and every year during Social Work Month, we talk about this in some sort of vague way, some sort of hints at perhaps collective work, or we'll have another task force on it. And I'm just talking about all, universities included. I'm not just talking about CSWE and NASW, but we did have a meeting in Martha's Vineyard. It'll be 2 years ago this summer, where we agreed to work on specific tasks. And mine was salary, coming up with some kind of salary chart. So I've been working on and off on this, and it's really hard to zero on an exact number that would be equitable.
Right.
And that's the best number I landed on. That didn't require, because there's a lot of argument even within social work of LCSW versus not. So do you get more for having a license, which does take longer to get than just graduating with your MSW? And I can go both directions on that. And at this point, I'm not sure anyone's feeling that picky. We really need to raise significantly the overall base, depending on whether or not we make variations between BSW, MSW, PhDs, DSWs, and licensed or unlicensed is fine. And in nursing, they do it. It's a little confusing, and it's not our exact, side by side, but it's about as close as it gets. And we can't really miss, I haven't had much chance online to talk about this yet. I'm going to do that later today, but the gendered quality of this. Teachers, nurses, and social work are highly gendered helping professions that are mostly women. And so when women make up most of the workforce in these areas, wages tend to be lower. And the reason the other two disciplines, teaching and nursing, have better wages is because they're supported by labor unions. And that's opinion. Some will argue about that as well, but it helps with that collective voice, and also giving you a script. These are the things that we deserve, because here, look at this number and look at this number. And I think it's why the number 93,000 resonated, because it was such a shock. And so you could choose. And what I did say in this roundtable meeting earlier this week, when CSWE and NASW were there, is we are going to lose the social workers. They can go, and those that are aspiring to be social workers can go and become a nurse psychiatric social worker, essentially, and make $50,000 more doing the exact same job. Why would we want to put them into debt with a social work degree when we can get them employed elsewhere for better money? And I feel like that's an ethical issue for us as well, especially for the professors who are teaching. And a lot of times, I know in my last couple of years, I was getting more and more worried about that as I saw the tuition rates go up. I couldn't see how they were going to graduate, pay off their loans, and actually purchase a home or a condo for their family, and even be middle class. I mean, poverty wages with enormous debt load. And it took me, I just paid off my student loans. I graduated in 2000, so that was 21 years.
Yeah.
And so it takes it right off the top. And that was at those tuition rates, which were significantly less. And so to me, I know it's shocking. And I don't think that we are not disclosing adequately. We're not doing informed consent on the debt you take on in order to become a helping professional. Because a lot of times when you come out, and I know even for myself, I was single and I could afford to have more debt before I had a family. So as your family grows, or if you are a sole supporter, it's going to make an impact. So it was okay perhaps when I was single. It's not okay with a family of 5. And there's a lot of assumptions that go on with gender and primary breadwinner we don't have time for today. But a lot of this feeds into it, along with healthcare and those who actually work part-time. And but I think you've put a couple of things out that are really important today. And I did just tweet out the 39.5. There's no surprise there. And these are reported hours too. There's a lot that goes into, and we're asked to volunteer all of the time, right? Outside of our jobs, or we're not even calling it part of our job in those hours. We know there's more, there's more there than what's obvious.
Well, it was stunning when governors began to say, we'd love nurses to work, we're going to pay you overtime. And in literally the same breath, they said, and we'd love social workers to volunteer to help at our testing sites.
Yeah.
I mean, really? Well, what it speaks to is there's a dance here. And we have what we may not, it may take a while to be able to get the others to dance differently, but we have to stop our side of the dance. We have to
Aren't
we
we
have
the
to
number one, numbers wise,
I'm
of
sorry?
mental health? Aren't we the social workers? Aren't LCSWs the number one form of mental health care in the US? I might be
Oh
wrong
yeah.
in that, but yeah.
And I mean, so what happens is these schools become huge factories of turning out more and more social workers, all of whom think they're going to be private practitioners and make $150,000 a year or something. Well, lo and behold, I have the data on that too. I cover it in the book. Um, the most that's going to happen, if you consider rent and all the rest, the
Yeah.
average social worker who ends up in private practice, uh, given all the other demands that it makes makes about $30,000 a year. So what it becomes is a part-time job on top of their other job. Now think
And
about that, folks.
informed consent on that too. I think that's there. We are selling that at our universities right now, that is an alternative at some point. I know when I was in school, it was, we'll work hard for the government programs and do all of the nitty gritty work. And then as you have a family, you go into private practice and you're going to make a whole bunch more money. But we don't disclose reimbursement rates and how much work it is to get reimbursed. And that's more of your job than talking to clients. And
That's
if
really
we
true.
disclose that part, people wouldn't want to do it. You have to you're not working for yourself. You're working for United Healthcare, Aetna, Anthem Blue Cross, and you're at the mercy of their CS reps pretty much. So there were a few comments on Twitter specifically about private practice and are you including us in there? And yes, absolutely everyone is included here as far as having a floor for an equitable salary, period. So, no matter how we're working.
Yes, wages, as we talk about the wealth gap, as we look at different professions, social work is not respected in our society. And so we need books such as the one you have that has emerged to talk about the historical impact of the economy and how we work with variety of populations. And so we need to be able to be respected. We should have equitable wages. And we have to look at gender issues, have to look at race, ethnicity, because we know that because of the wealth gap, we know because of the systematic structure, systematic racism in our society. There are different studies that talked about how you have a resume. And if the resume appeared to be one of ethnic group, it may be put in the trash. I had a colleague at a training maybe a couple weeks ago who said that when in an interview, they cannot tell her ethnicity over the phone. And the job was available.
Yeah.
The job was maybe 5 minutes from her home. Traveled to the job and they saw her and the job was filled. And so we have a lot of things we have to look at in our society as we look at equity and injustice, as we try to bring about change, because social workers of all ethnic groups and all genders should have equitable wages as we move forward.
Thank you, Gary. That's a great place to end on this because there's obviously more to say, but the experience of your colleague says everything, right? There's multiple layers that we have to be willing to look at. I mean, part of what 2020 shows is there's a reckoning going on in the United States. Well, guess what? The reckoning includes those of us in social work too. And I think that it's real important that, we continue to have this conversation, not about my book necessarily, but about the ideas that are in it and the issues that both of you have raised. So I know it'll be continued.
Well, before we go, let's make sure we put out a couple of ideas as far as action. So the overwhelming feedback is we're all tired of talking about how to do, that we need to do this. Who do we contact? What are we asking for? how do we get this moving forward? And there were several comments like, I want to be part of this conversation. When is it happening? What do we do? So now that we know, now what do we do? Who do we call?
Well, I won't get into it all. The longest chapter in the book is the answer to that question, which is, I've been an organizer my entire life, or my entire adult life. And I'm very respectful of social workers who work in many ways and have a lot of different things to do. At the same time, this reckoning does have to happen. So I won't go into it all, but people have to begin to recognize, that self-care alone will not take care of your need, that we have to look at ways of collective action. The one thing I identify that could be an organizing campaign, because if a person spells out a whole campaign, do 12 things, it's like, that's not fair. That's undemocratic. It doesn't give the voice to people who haven't even been part of it. But there is a very simple campaign to begin, and that is a revision of the Code of Ethics to reflect the self-interest and needs of workers with the same respect for those workers, for social workers, as we give our clients. There are 2 or 3 places where that could be done. We need to look at what nurses do. The Nurses Code of Ethics is a rallying cry of respect for patients and for themselves. And we need the same thing as a beginning campaign, is that people could come together around is enough. And then as we build towards that, these other issues, we create the conversations about salary, about income, about all these other, about the racial inequity built into so much of what these Dollar General conversations are about, that we need to have as well. But a concrete campaign with a concrete goal, respecting collective action, and then creating these kinds of conversations while we have that campaign, I would say is a great place to begin.
I think that's great. I would love to see us be able to reject far too low of salaries and feel empowered to do that.
Right.
I know that some of the conversation happening is, well, please have our social work organizations support us on a floor here. There should be some sort of ethical statement on, we shouldn't be paying less than X. And that might mean a percentage over the local living wage, kind of like the fight for 15. So I think those are doable. And I don't know if they're going to do it on their own organizationally, which is where, Steve, you've gone back and forth on that too, where, do we start at the bottom? Do we start at the top? And we have to do a little bit of everything, I think, here. So I really appreciate you.
Yes, I think there are so many different frameworks that have been utilized previously. We can do locally as well as globally because we're a global force. And so I believe that organizations can be one front, as well as we have to address it locally with our local agencies, and we can do it that way. And I think that as we build locally, there can be a national movement. And so I'm committed to meeting with social workers in my area to address it, because we have poverty wages. And so if we continue to talk about it and not to address it, and some people may have to go on strike.
That's right. And, there's maybe even scripting some of the replies to LinkedIn recruitments, because there is no shortage of recruitment emails that go out via LinkedIn to attach social workers to move to some contracted position, and even for the VA and such. But I've just started myself, even though I'm not open for employment, instead of ignoring those, I've started replying to them saying, this is in no way an equitable salary. This is what it needs to look like. You're not going to get anyone with the salary. Polite, but firm. This isn't sufficient, period. And maybe if enough people start doing that, we'll get a better offer in the first place. So.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time to let me talk about the book and the themes. It's like the reckoning's underway, folks, and I think our podcast can be part of that as well.
Well stated. And I think that's why it hit 27,000 with just one tweet with a number in it, which was $93,000 to be equitable with MSNs on Twitter this week during Social Work Month. So we're getting a lot of feedback about that, and I'm hoping we get to continue that discussion online. So make sure, I've already seen your comments, so keep engaging.
I'm gonna send a couple more. Gary, I want to thank you for the amazing technical work you've done to really professionalize us. Christy, I want to thank you for the courage you show in putting this stuff up on Twitter and making the conversation richer. It's what you're both training me in ways that are really helpful. Anna, with all that you carry, all that you do, we're going to make sure that your voice continues to be heard as well. And we appreciate all that you've done. You've certainly done a lot for me as well. So thank you, everybody, from my heart.